One of the things that blew up from an interview you did with Lex Friedman, who's, I think, an excellent interviewer, and it was a fascinating 3-hour or so interview you did with him. But one of the things that went viral from that was you inferring that there are no kind of innocent civilians in Gaza. Let's take a listen.
There is not a hostage who's come out who I've spoken with who found any Gazan Palestinian who expressed even the slightest human kindness to them. If you look at the footage from the 7th, it's all celebration. I'm sure you've heard the audio recording of the young man who ends up in one of the communities in the south of Israel. And he says, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands. Oh, Father, your son has killed 10 Jews. He goes, I want to show you, Dad. I want to show you. I've killed Jews with my own hands. Your son. Put mother on the phone.
That incident you talked about, I remember, it's utterly horrific. And there's no doubt that, I mean, Hamas, I've always called them terrorists from the start. They are disgusting terrorists and should be treated as nothing better or worse. Where I would take issue with the categorization of there are no civilians in Gaza, half the population is under 18, which means a lot of the people there are genuine kids, right? And I think all kids are innocent in these situations. They might be in a home where people older than them are trying to direct them and whatever, but they're still innocent people. And secondly, we are beginning to see protests against Hamas in Gaza. People are being executed for taking part in these, but we are seeing some protests, which would suggest to me that there is a rising groundswell of people in Gaza who do not agree with the doctrine of Hamas, can see how bad it's been for the Palestinian people, for Gaza, and want nothing to do with this. So, I mean, now you've seen how it's blown up. Would you reframe what you said there? Would you clarify it?
I hadn't seen that it had blown up. I'm happy to clarify. No, I never said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Of course, I regard children as being innocent civilians, of course. Well, the point I made was there is a lot that we ought to learn outside of this conflict about what it means when you see the events of the 7th of Israeli hostages being taken into Gaza and being greeted by cheering crowds. I would submit that if a group of terrorists came into the center of London with a truckload of young women whose tendons they'd cut and who they'd raped and paraded them through London, I'd like to think that Londoners would be decent enough to stop them and at least not to stand by and cheer the Great Rape Parade. But that's not what happened in Gaza. And you can go back a lot further and talk about all of the history and the animosity between the sides. But, you know, the citizens of Gaza did have a choice after the withdrawal by Israel of all Jews from Gaza in 2005. They did have a choice on who to vote for. Perhaps unwisely, the George W. Bush administration pushed for elections in Gaza, and as the Palestinian Authority and others were worried about, Hamas won the elections, and they never had another election since. Hamas has obviously used the 18 years it had to misgovern the Gaza, not to create the flourishing Palestinian state they could have created, not to do that, but to indoctrinate their children into hatred, to build tunnels in which they hide their missiles and not their civilians. A member of Hamas was interviewed a few months ago, and it was an Arabic interviewer, I think it was an Al Arabiya, who said, why don't you allow the Gazan civilians to take shelter in the tunnel network that you've got all across Gaza? And he said, no, but the tunnels aren't for the civilians. They're for our fighters, our terrorists, and our rockets. Well, look, that undoubtedly makes it an incredibly difficult place to operate in militarily. Incredibly difficult. And that is what Hamas planned. And I think that Western media, Western observers and others at least have to recognize that. Hamas did this atrocity, started this war, and it knew that whatever way Israel responded, innocent civilians would be harmed. Yes, there would be buildings, including hospitals and others, that would be damaged because Hamas, guess what, operates along none of the rules of war. Israel, like the British Army and the American Army, the IDF has to operate along the rules of war. Hamas not only doesn't operate along those rules, it actually uses the rules against its enemies. And, you've known this since the start of the conflict. I've known it. Many other people have remained woefully ignorant about it. But it has made it inevitable that there would be high civilian casualties. I don't believe they're as high as the figures that Hamas puts out, and which much of the Western media parrots with no problem. But of course there are going to be civilian casualties. And that is the result of the war that Hamas started. And there is a solution to this. There is an answer to this, which is that if Gaza is to have any future as a Palestinian entity, its young people are not brought up to believe their purpose in life should be the annihilation of their neighbors. Hamas had 18 years. They could have educated their young in a different way, but they didn't. And now, if anything, is the time when they could. And these brave Gazans, who finally, thank God, have started to uprise, and we'll see how real it is, but it's clearly real because there was a very brave young Gazan man the other day who stood up against Hamas, and he was tortured, and his body was dumped on his family's front door by Hamas a couple of days later. We'll see if these protests have any results. But one thing that is important to remember is it's perfectly likely, in fact, it seems overwhelmingly likely to me, that these protests against Hamas that are trying to kindle in Gaza are not because they are, and again, I'm reading into this, but it seems likeliest to me. It's not because these are people who you and I, the average American or Brit or anything, would love to sit down with. It's that they have decided they've had enough of Hamas's rule, because it was Hamas's rule and misrule and its corruption and then its starting of a war that has led the people of Gaza to this terrible position. A final quick thing on that, if I may, which is also, let's not forget that in the lies upon lies that have been built up in the last 18 months, so many people have been able to simultaneously point out the considerable youth boom in Gaza. And they're the same people who have been saying since 2005 that the Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. Choose, guys. Choose which of these things is true, because they can't both be.
How do you think this war now ends, Doug? Does the ceasefire, sort of unravelled? It's hard to argue that a lot of Gaza has been completely destroyed. Trump has called for the complete displacement, of course, of 2 million Palestinians. I don't think that's going to happen. And he's obviously trying to force people to get together and work out what is going to happen. But what's the end game here? And one of the more worrying things I saw was the American intelligence report suggesting that they think for every Hamas terrorist who's been killed, someone with the same ideology has already stepped up to replace them.
Well, that's a perennial problem in fighting against death cults, is that there's always this claim that if you kill their leaders will simply be replaced. I'm actually not sure that people like Yahya Sinwar and Hassan Nasrallah are easily replaceable figures. In fact, I think they're not at all easily replaceable figures. But for the level of people below them, there's this quandary. It's been a quandary that America faced after 9/11 and answered in part, but unsuccessfully in other parts, which is, if you're attacked by terrorists, and there is always a cohort of people who will say, if you kill those terrorists or attack those terrorists, you'll create more terrorists. And that's just a circular logic that certain people can't get out of. My own belief is that there has been, and I've seen the destruction of Gaza myself. Hamas booby-trapped so many buildings across the place, and much of the destruction that we see on the ground, and I've seen myself, is the result of the Israelis having to set off explosions that set off all the secondary explosions of all of the other bombs, IEDs, and other booby traps that Hamas has placed around the Gaza. The current status quo opinion, until Donald Trump made that intervention the other week, the status quo opinion seemed to be that there would be a ceasefire at some point. Of course, as I've said since the beginning of the conflict could have ended at any moment, or at least ceased, if Hamas had given back the hostages. And they still haven't given them back, because only a death cult like Hamas uses even the dead bodies of their enemies as a shield to protect their own lives. But park that aside for a moment. The presumption seemed to be that there would be some kind of ceasefire arrangement, an ongoing release of live, brutalized Israeli hostages and the dead bodies of Israelis, and then yet more Palestinian terrorists handed over from Israeli prisons, and that there would be a ceasefire. The problem with that paradigm always was the same, which is the international community and Israel would then be expected to build the Gaza back up again. Nobody knew who was going to rule Gaza under the next iteration, and one of the two Israeli war aims was always to destroy Hamas, at least that is to make them operationally incapable and effectively unable to rule Gaza. But the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to run Gaza. Egypt doesn't want to run Gaza. Israel certainly doesn't want to run Gaza. So what would happen? Most likely thing is the international community would be asked to chip in yet more billions of dollars to Gaza to rebuild it, for Hamas or a Hamas-like group to seize control again, and for a war to be launched again several years from now, and for the same thing to happen. I think that is a hopeless paradigm, which left and right, Labour, Conservative, Republican, Democrat, have been on the side of for too long. What they don't realize is this is one of the reasons why this conflict has kept on going. It's because people, every time the Hamas or other terrorist groups start the war, Israel applies to it, that you stop at the status and you go back to the status quo ante. That's what I mentioned in my book was a case in 2006, the first war in Lebanon and Israel that I witnessed. At the end of that conflict, there was a ceasefire. One of the deals was that with an international peacekeeping force, Hezbollah would not be allowed to build up its weaponry in the south of Lebanon. Guess what? International peacekeepers who frankly have no beef in this, Irish, Sri Lankan and other so-called peacekeepers just stood by. Hezbollah amassed about 160,000 short and long-range missiles exactly where they weren't meant to in the 2006 ceasefire. They fired them for years, and on the 8th of October 2023, they let go their barrage day upon day into central and northern Israel. I'm, at any rate, fed up with the paradigm that continues the perpetuation of this conflict. I don't believe this should be just the most recent Gaza war. I think it should be the last one. I don't want it to be the third Lebanon war. I want it to be the last one. And in my view, for that to happen, the death cults of Hamas and Hezbollah have to not just be destroyed, but to have their putative supporters and their real supporters have to realize that they have lost, that there is no future for them or the region in sustaining this death cult idea that you simply have to educate, as it were, the next generation to grow up to try to annihilate their neighbors. It should be that that stops. How it happens, we'll see. But Donald Trump the other week was the first person among world leaders to say something new, like, as he said, the Gaza is pretty unlivable at the moment. It's largely true that. It's largely true. It's very smashed up. But he said it's basically unlivable, so why don't we encourage people who want to leave to leave? Of course, that has caused outrage elsewhere. But it's at least a new idea in the paradigm, which otherwise is going to be stuck in this perpetual violence cycle.